The United States Congress is on its third day of debating who should occupy the position of third in line to the American presidency, more commonly known as Speaker of the House. Now, if you're following mainstream media coverage of this House Speaker election, then you have almost certainly been told that allowing 3 whole days of debate on this rather significant question threatens the very foundation of American society. Indeed, to hear establishment mavens all tell the story, the failure of Congress to smoothly and swiftly and immediately elect a speaker that's been preordained with little debate, as it usually does, has put the U.S. government on the verge of collapse, and no less than our national security has been gravely compromised. Have you ever noticed how often you hear that even temporary failure to snap into line and heed the orders of establishment decrees creates grave dangers for America? Here from the Daily Mail, quote, top Republican Representative Nicole Malakatz has told the Daily Mail, quote, China, Cuba, and Iran are laughing at the party during the endless speaker votes that have stopped members getting security clearances. Oh, for sure, for sure. Kevin McCarthy is such an imposing and intimidating projection of American global power that Vladimir Putin has begun ignoring his war in Ukraine, and Chinese Communist Party leaders have forgotten about the COVID crisis and rising citizen anger sweeping their country, and Iranian mullahs are neglecting domestic protests because they're paying such rapt attention to the 3-day bickering in the lower house of the United States Congress over whether Kevin McCarthy or some equally colorless, bland establishment figure will finally fulfill their lifelong careerist ambition of becoming the next Speaker of the House. But no debate at all is permitted on major questions of U.S. democracy. Apparently, a healthy democracy requires that everyone march in lockstep, follow orders from on high, and never question anything, much like the Democratic Party, and especially its progressive wing, have so adeptly mastered. Who knew that our time-tested and powerful democracy could not survive a few days of debate and disagreement on our most important questions? But that is what the voices of establishment authority want you to believe. Every day that goes by that entails some more debate rather than consensus, another brick in the wall of American democracy crumbles. Our government and all the majestic things it does for us every day for our lives comes to a grinding halt. The New York Times proclaimed, lacking a speaker, one part of government ceases to function. The Washington Post asked, does the House even exist right now? CNN's chief Russiagate queen, Natasha Bertrand, who got promoted to the network after becoming the first, while at Politico, to spread the CIA lie that the Hunter Biden laptop was Russian disinformation, and is now held up as some sort of national security expert. I guess that's what one becomes after spending enough years as the U.S. security state's most reliable puppet. She gravely warned, now the speaker impasse is impacting U.S. national security. Over at Axios, Mike Allen melodramatically intoned, quote, House Republicans have systematically gutted the power of their leaders and institutionally de facto anarchy. Anarchy! These media people are such drama queens. He then goes on to write, quote, long ago are the days of rank and file members pining for more money or endorsements or committee assignments from their top leaders. Now it's the rank and file lawmakers and outside allies juiced by social media holding the real power. Think about that for a moment. He wasn't saying that as though it was positive. The entire media establishment has decided that a handful of Congress members challenging the suffocating anti-democratic centralization of power in Congress is a grave crisis, not just of governance, but of American democracy, even national security. Not only that, but the refusal of 20 House Republicans to capitulate after being allowed 72 hours of what they regard as a dangerous tantrum is leading us to the only other alternative, anarchy. As they tell it, you have all these uncredentialed conservative ruffians, meaning the people sent by American citizens to be the representatives in Congress, using their power and leverage to extract concessions before voting for someone to rule over the House of Representatives. This is apparently a virtual uprising, a riot, anarchy. Irreverence not seen since a few pro-Trump Facebook users put their feet up on Nancy Pelosi's sacred desk and got sent to prison for 5 years for doing so. But is any of this really true? Is the opposite of centralization and authoritarianism really anarchy? Or is it, democracy? One of the dirty secrets of how Congress works in the modern era has been that actual members of Congress, your representatives, have very little power, almost none. They're more like little tiny chess pieces moved around for a tiny coterie of party leaders, often just 2 or 3 people in a small room making all the decisions. Members of Congress are allowed to do very little without the explicit approval of leadership. Strangling and suffocating debate, new ideas, and disruptions to the status quo. That's why so many of them are just social media stars. They have no other power. It's the dynamic that has turned Congress into a profoundly anti-democratic institution. And it's one of the main reasons why we get so little reform and so much corruption out of it. And what is most remarkable about all of this is that the tiny number of real leaders in these rooms, these back rooms of the Capitol, making all the decisions, along with lobbyists, are from different political parties. And therefore, according to Washington's most sacred lore, are completely incapable of agreeing on anything. After all, when you put a Republican and a Democrat in a room together, this narrative goes, nothing ensues but food fights and bitter and angry bickering and all-out war between people totally incapable of setting aside their deep and entrenched fundamental ideological differences to agree on things for the good of the nation. But there are a few farces more transparent than that one. Does anyone really believe that there are massive gaps between the worldview of multimillionaire Nancy Pelosi and multimillionaire Mitch McConnell, both of whom are married to people who also wield extreme levels of power and wealth in Washington, Wall Street, and beyond? Do you really believe that Chuck Schumer, after decades in Washington, building a power base by raising hundreds of millions of dollars from Wall Street, has more in common with your liberal neighbor than he does with Kevin McCarthy, who, after years and years in Washington, building a power base by raising hundreds of millions of dollars from Wall Street, occupies a seat at the table alongside Schumer, Pelosi, and McConnell as they keep American policies of crony capitalism, endless war, corporatism, imperialism, and militarism churning along without any real dissent or disruption or even much transparency at all. One of the most common tricks of the establishment American media is to focus incessantly and exclusively and intensely on the small handful of areas where the establishment wings of both political parties actually do disagree, actually have real disputes. Things like abortion and gender ideology, mass immigration, sort of, and a couple of other culture war fights that, while important, do not really touch on, let alone shape or change, how power in the United States is distributed. While they constantly dramatize these small handfuls of debates, they ignore the far more significant policy areas in which the establishment wings of both parties completely agree, which happens to be most of them. When is the last time you ever heard any real debate about whether we should be in NATO, whether we should have military forces in dozens of countries around the world, whether we should be interfering in the internal affairs of countless countries, things that the majority of the American populace disagrees with and yet continues to happen? The politics where the parties agree, like those, are ignored by the media. And that creates this fairy tale, this theater, this illusion that the two parties have absolutely nothing in common, that they are constantly at each other's throat and they can't agree on anything, no more bipartisanship in Washington. And thus you have so much power as a citizen and voter when deciding which party will rule. It changes everything after all. Elections have consequences, we're told over and over. But do they? Do elections have consequences in the United States? When, for instance, is the last time you heard about anything concerning the Patriot Act? Remember that, the Patriot Act? That was the bill passed very quickly in the weeks after the 9/11 attack that gave previously unthinkable powers, un-American powers, to the U.S. security state to spy on American citizens and arrest, detain, and prosecute them with far lower barriers than ever before. Even in the climate right after 9/11, when the American population was understandably scared, traumatized, and angry, and thus very unified, almost nothing that the Bush-Cheney administration demanded was even questioned back then. Even in that climate, the Patriot Act was considered a radical piece of legislation. To calm nerves about it, a provision was inserted that made it temporary. Oh, don't worry, we were told, this is just an emergency provision that will expire in 4 short years unless, and it's highly unlikely that it'll happen, unless the threat of Al-Qaeda is still imminent and the Congress decides to renew it. But the default assumption, we were told, is that it will just fade away once this emergency passes, so no need to worry about it. Sure, okay, fine, it's radical. We never thought we would ever enact anything like this, even its proponents conceded. But it's only going to be with us for a very short period of time. But like most radical temporary state powers enacted in the name of some emergency, it turns out there was nothing temporary about the Patriot Act at all. It never faded away. And it's now part of the American woodwork, never debated or discussed. It was renewed very quietly in 2005 with an overwhelming bipartisan vote and the support of the Bush White House. And then again in 2010 with another overwhelming bipartisan vote with the support of the Obama White House. And then again in 2015 with the same thing. And then again in 2019, this time with the support of the Trump White House and the Progressive Democratic House Caucus, who quietly handed Trump and his executive branch renewed Patriot Act powers of spying and detention, even while calling him Hitler. That's how bipartisan Washington is. The same thing happened in 2018 when the Trump White House opposed proposed limits and safeguards on the NSA's spying power to spy on American citizens. Even as Nancy Pelosi and Adam Schiff were calling Trump the new Hitler, they both voted, along with hordes of Democrats, to give this new Hitler all spying powers and to block any limits on his ability to use those powers. You probably don't remember any of this because it got scant media attention. That's because both parties were in full agreement on it. And thus, like all issues that receive support of the establishment wings of both parties, no matter how weighty, the corporate press downplays or ignores it. To them, issues are only worth media coverage when the two parties fight over them, not when they agree, even though the establishment wings of both parties agree on most things. So in the meantime, the Washington establishment churns on, mostly in the back rooms of Congress, with very few people watching. That's when tens of billions of dollars fly out the door, when the $1.7 trillion omnibus spending is stuffed full with enough special favors to secure the needed votes, and when the Pentagon, the NSA, the CIA, and the private arms industry and Wall Street are given everything they want, need, and demand. And while all that happens, many Americans remain convinced that the two parties can't agree on anything, that they are fighting like cats and dogs, simply can't make anything happen, when in fact they're making a lot happen. And what this process requires more than anything else is smooth bipartisan consensus. A small handful of omnipotent party leaders from each party who are willing to play the game, join hands, and ensure that, totally insulated from election outcomes and public debate, the Washington consensus churns on. And that's why it upsets establishment voices so much to have any disruption at all in Washington. The main reason they hated Trump was not ideological. After all, the permanent power factions in Washington easily managed to override his will and ensure that his administration, despite the sideshow of his disruptive and heterodox tweets, mostly aligned with the bipartisan tradition of Washington policy over the last several decades. What they hated about Trump was that he created a fuss. He drew attention to what they were doing. He was unpredictable. He wasn't presidential and didn't maintain the facade that covers what they do. And he threatened to disrupt what is almost always otherwise a smooth process that wears the finery of democracy but bears little resemblance to it. And that's what is so upsetting to them. That's why they are using fear-mongering, one of the few effective tricks they have left, to convince you that everything is going to fall apart. China and Iran will attack your family unless everyone immediately stops with this nonsense of debate and instead gets into line, stop fighting and debating and arguing, and instead keep the wheels of Washington power churning and the core doctrine of establishment bipartisan orthodoxy safely hidden from view. Thanks for watching this clip from System Update. Catch our full shows for free, live weekdays at 7 p.m. Eastern on Rumble, and join our locals community at greenwald.locals.com for all of my written journalism, exclusive after-show Q&As, and more.